Welcome to the SportsPro podcast.
Hi everyone and welcome to another SportsPro podcast. My name is Eoin Connolly. I'm the editor-at-large at SportsPro. Hope you're all very well. Great to be back with you once again. Now, obviously 2020 has not been an optimal year for getting new entities off the ground, depending on your disposition at least. But today we are going to be talking about a new venture, this one in the sport of triathlon. The Professional Triathletes Organisation was officially launched in January. It is, as the name suggests, a professional members body, and it was created to improve the commercial prospects for that sports elite, working up some events and assets whose proceeds they can share in, but which will also grow the sport as a whole. It's going to sit alongside the other promoters and governing bodies in triathlon, and while it's taken some cues from other individual sports like golf and tennis, it will be doing its own thing as well. Speaking of tennis, this is also what Chris Kermode did next. I'm referring, of course, to the former ATP executive chairman who left the men's tennis tour last year after 6 years at the helm and a time in the sport where he successfully established the ATP finals in London. He'd launched the experimental ATP Next Gen finals, brought in new sponsors and new growth and other new events and much more besides. Chris is now the vice chairman of the PTO as well as a board member. And I spoke to him and, just as importantly, to Sam Renouf, who is the PTO chief executive, about the organization's concept and its mission. We discussed the potential of triathlon commercially and as a broadcast spectacle, backing from Michael Moritz, the challenge of launching and coordinating activities in a pandemic, how PTO events can be different, and indeed how sports events can be different, from the use of athlete profiles to drive media attention to the possibilities of fan participation in content. We covered that among many other things. There's lots to get through in what is a really interesting conversation. Should just note that we had to change our recording setup for this one a bit. We were using a different platform due to some technical difficulties, but hopefully that won't affect your enjoyment too much and the quality is still pretty reasonable. Speaking of changes to the podcast, regular listeners might have noticed a slightly altered release schedule in the past couple of weeks. That's not a permanent shift by any means. It's just an adjustment for some of the other things we have going on that we need to cover here on the pod and elsewhere through the team. That might persist for a little while with more episodes, some weeks than others. So just a heads up. It's because we have plenty happening right now, with the Insider Series returning on the 30th of September, looking at athletes in business. SportsProInsiderSeries.com for more. SportsPro Asia is coming on the 21st and 22nd of October. SportsProAsia.com for everything you need there. We've got a new magazine out towards the end of next month with a focus on the sports broadcast sector. And you thought we'd forgotten about it, didn't you? But 50 Most Marketable is back for 2020. It's going to be a bit different this year, but it's going to be very, very interesting indeed. So keep eyes peeled and ears to the ground for that over the next few weeks. We'll have some stuff here on the podcast. We'll have lots more over on sportspromedia.com. Okay, that's what's coming up over the next few weeks. Over the next 45 minutes or so, we've got Sam Renouf and Chris Kermode.
This is the SportsPro podcast.
Sam Renouf and Chris Kermode, welcome to the SportsPro podcast.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, good to be here.
So Sam, for the record, you are the chief executive of the Professional Triathletes Organisation. Chris, you are better known to some of our listeners in another guise, and we'll get onto that a little bit later. But what's your role now at the PTO?
So I've come on as vice chairman and just started recently, and on the board of the PTO.
Okay, well we can talk a bit about the kind of route that's taken you there over the last few months and some of the things that you're hoping to accomplish. But Sam, why don't we start with you and just have a quick introduction to the PTO and what its mission is?
Sure, happily. Yeah. So we've been set up recently. We've sort of launched commercially in January, though the organization's been underway for about 3 years, and we're essentially the membership body of professional triathletes. So set up very similarly to the ATP, hence obviously the relevance of Chris joining us recently, and the PGA Tour as a member body owned and operated by professional triathletes to further the sport of professional triathlon, or more specifically the professional aspects of the sport of triathlon. Our mission is to celebrate the sport, and the professional aspects are how we see that being driven.
And where do you see yourself sitting alongside the existing tour operators, event promoters that work within the sport?
So it's very similar, without again referencing too many other sports. It's a real comparison to the other codes that have a professional athlete body. We sit alongside professional tour organizers, or race organizers, more the vernacular we would use in triathlon, and underneath the governance of the national governing bodies and indeed the international governing body, which in triathlon is the ITU. So we're here as the newest member of the triathlon community, and indeed, I guess, the newest member of the professional sports community.
Is there any sense that you're going to be competing with those? Is there any sense that you're going to be, offering? Obviously, you have the ITU, as you say, which kind of is the ranking route into the Olympic Games and all that type of stuff. And then you have Ironman, which is offering an ultra product. Do you sit alongside those as you see it? Do you sit as a competitor? Did you see another way of getting events to happen? Is it purely a case of having that little bit more athlete control? What gap were you going for?
Yeah, it's certainly we sit alongside, but very different in sort of the outlook and both the mission of the organization. So I mean, to touch on why we've come about and really the last few months, we were set up for really a philosophical reason, which is following in the path of other sports organizations, and indeed other sports, where the athletes united and went on a path of self-determination is something we talk about a lot here. So in whether it's in golf, whether it's in tennis, whether it's in darts, there are many different sports where the professionals recognized that there was probably a better path for the sport, and so they united, formed an organization, and in doing so, that unity brought power, and ultimately they're able to use that power to further the sport. And that really gets onto sort of the commercial side. So, I mean, philosophically, we're here to take the sport forward with the professionals in mind, and the professionals as the driving force. But from a commercial perspective, there is this isn't a philanthropic venture. We're very much intending to create profits and increase the revenues in the sport. And for that reason, we brought on a financial investor in January, just before the world all went crazy, and that's really enabled us to go forward with our business plan. Obviously, heavily impacted by COVID-19, goes without saying.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's also something I'm sure we'll get onto, and it kind of hovers over every conversation. But let's look at the structure a little bit. You're a membership organisation, you have investment as well. But how does everything sit within that? When you've also begun to develop your own event properties, what else do we need to know about how the PTO operates?
So structure is a membership body. So we're a non-profit at our core, and we're representing the professional triathletes that race around the world. There's around 350 members. Essentially every member of every athlete that has a professional license is a member. It doesn't cost them anything. They just have to be sanctioned by their governing body. And from both a governance and a structure, I suppose, if I deal with that question, governance wise, non-profit, we have both an athlete board and then a business board, which Chris has just joined. And then underneath that, obviously, to be able to create events and go on to sort of our plans, as you touched on just then, we needed investment, we needed finance and resources. And so we created a commercial entity underneath, which is, owns all of the commercial rights, which, given the current environment, I think we're seeing a lot of trends towards sporting bodies looking at how their commercial rights are structured and potentially bringing on institutional investment. We did that pretty early on. And so we have formed what I believe, and you could probably, when you tell me otherwise, you would know better than me. I think we actually have a unique structure in sport in that we have a 50-50 ownership of the commercial rights between athletes and capital. And, capital is maybe a very blunt word to use for an investor, and our investor is a very long-term, very successful technology investor in the form of Crankstart Investments, which is the personal vehicle of Sir Michael Moritz of Sequoia Capital. So he's a Silicon Valley investor, one of the first people to sort of back Google, Airbnb, and all these different companies. And so obviously we needed to have investment to get the venture moving. And so we've created what I believe is the only model in sport, but please correct me if I'm wrong, where we have complete alignment between finance and talent in the form of the athletes. So what we've done is create a joint venture which holds all of the commercial rights of the PTO. So as we create events and broadcast rights and things like that, that's owned by the PTO commercial entity. And that's 50-50 between our investors and the athletes, which I think is unique. And it should cause alignment, into the future as we build out the organization.
What kind of conversations did you have? Obviously you've brought Chris on now, and we'll bring him in into the chat in just a moment. But what kind of conversations did you have elsewhere in the world of sport before coming up with that way of doing things?
Well, two things really. One, it's really that triathlon is a bit of a sleeping giant within the sports industry in terms of its value, and that's mainly because of the lack of broadcast structure, which is a longer topic we can touch on. But to give you a couple of statistics, the incumbents or the fans within triathlon have some of the highest household incomes of any sport. In fact, it's dramatically higher than most groups realize. So in North America, to give you an example, the average household income of a long distance triathlete is $220,000 versus just under 100 for golf. And so most of our conversations actually started there, is that this is a hugely valuable sport that has grown dramatically over the last 10, 15, 20 years, but is massively under commercialized because of the lack of professional and broadcast sport. It's largely a participation based business, right? And you touched on Ironman before. They're very, very successful in selling essentially grassroots sport. So that's really where our conversations first started, was really explaining the commercial value, sort of this hidden giant that we think can be commercialized and brought to market. And then secondly, speaking very candidly, we had a lot of really interested people speak to us, and we were very lucky in that we were able to be quite choosy with which partners we would have, and that we only really wanted people that would buy into the 50-50 model of alignment with the athletes. And that's why, in Michael Moritz, so Crankstart Investments is his investment group. He was a very natural fit because, of course, he's backed lots and lots of companies over the years and is very used to aligning with talent.
Chris, I wanted to bring you in at this point. When was your first point of contact with the PTO?
Well, actually, I had a call from Charles Adamo, whose sort of brainchild this is, or about 3 years ago, actually, when I was heading up the ATP, and he was just it was a casual conversation, sort of saying he was doing this and really just wanting some bits of advice, and I passed on what I thought was good advice, and then I didn't hear anything till January this year. And we had another conversation, and then about 2 months after that, so sort of March, he called and said, would I be interested in coming on the board and the start of this journey?
And I mean, obviously, those initial conversations, you were in a very different place. You had a very exacting full-time role elsewhere in the sports industry. But coming into this year, what was it about this opportunity that appealed?
It's a very good question, because quite a lot of people have asked me that, and there's sort of one response really, but there's two, but they're linked. But the first one was actually a childish thing that I have, which is when people say things are very difficult to do or impossible to do or to achieve, makes me actually very interested to prove people wrong. And so it's getting involved in a sport that, as Sam has mentioned, it has huge potential, but hasn't even really started to hit that potential. And, I spoke to a lot of people in sport who said, it's going to be a very difficult product to sell and to grow. And it just appealed to a challenge for me to be involved in this. And the reason I'm convinced that this will work is very simple. People overcomplicate the sports model. They overcomplicate, the sort of ingredients that are needed to make a sport successful. And it is, I said it time and time again at the ATP, but sport is about caring who wins over someone else. That is as simple as that. And there are various types of sport. So you can break it down into, you obviously have sport that has country versus country. You have sport that are team sports, and you have individual sports. And the country versus country sports model is, the Olympics as an example, World Cup, soccer. These are very simple sports products to sell because it taps into everyone's sort of jingoistic desire, and everyone has it. And so you immediately tap into that, and almost whatever the sport is going to be successful. Team sports are the midway through, which is where, team sports, like the country ones, are tribal. So you go with friends to support a team that probably is in your DNA. Your father supported the same team. I think of sort of Premier League soccer. The grandfather supported the same team. You go with a whole load of mates that support the same team. So you go as a tribal unit. And again, that's actually quite relatively easy proposition to sell. And some teams actually expand their reach way more than, say, a geographical location. So you look at somewhere like Manchester United, they've actually not just tapped into that team and local thing. They've made it a national desire to follow, and even international, and especially in Asia, they're huge. So, but it is belonging to something. Now, individual sports are much harder to sell because you don't have the team spirit and you don't have the country element. But the principle is still the same. You're putting on a sport, and you have to care who wins that event. So in the triathlon world, like golf, individual sport, like tennis, it's about creating characters, it's about storytelling, and everybody in the world has a story to tell. And once you know that story, there's an emotional connection with that person, and that's likely for you to tune in and to follow the sport. And so I like the part that it's a difficult proposition, a challenging one, coupled with that I do think if you stick to the simple principles of selling sport, that it really can work. The other huge attraction for me was, it is a global sport. Not many sports are truly global, but triathlons are done everywhere in the world, and that's also very, very appealing. And to start something, right at the beginning of its journey for me, with a new venture, it was very exciting.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but when you looked at the commercial market as it exists right now in triathlon, what was your take on it? What was your understanding of it, and what kind of work do you think needs to go in to connect that vision that you have of kind of selling stories and selling the stories of individual athletes in that environment? How do you connect those dots?
Well, I think it's event based. So you build up events that have real meaning, and you look at all the big sports around the world, especially the global sports. They have iconic events that become the sort of destination, event venue to go to. You look at golf. You have, Augusta. I'm not a golf fan, but I'm a sports fan, and I find myself watching Augusta for some reason, because I know that's the sort of, it means something. And so when you create events that have meaning, then you can actually get an audience, to follow it, to get engaged in it, coupled with storytelling about the athletes, and that combination of events and athletes ultimately will be the driver of success.
Sam, I wanted to bring you back in. From your perspective, having Chris come in, what kind of expertise were you looking at bringing in when you did bring Chris on board?
I think it's probably safe to say so two main areas. I mean, there are lots, and that's why you were probably pausing as you were asking the question. But there are lots, but if I had to put them into two buckets of experience that are most relevant to us, there's obviously the commercialization of the sport and launching, as Chris said, this is all based on events, right? So whether it's launching, a major event like Chris put together in the O2, many years ago, but has obviously been hugely successful the last decade. There's that aspect, which goes from ticket sales to broadcast rights to sponsorships. Obviously, it's the full gamut. And then very, very relevantly, it's the other side of it is that we are an athlete organization. We're a membership-based organization that's obviously looking after and promoting the interests of individual professional athletes. And there are not many people that have been involved in an organization with that structure and have been used to, both the great opportunities and frankly the difficulties of working with major sports personalities, and in triathlon they certainly aren't as major as they are in tennis in terms of resources or wealth or notoriety, but it's our intention to change that, right? And so having someone with that experience is hugely valuable.
Have you mapped out a path over 3 years, 5 years, any kind of period like that? Obviously it's a difficult question to answer at this moment in time, but what are some of the signposts that you have for the PTO?
Well, yes, I mean certainly we raised north of $10 million US. So to raise that kind of amount from a venture capitalist, we absolutely had to have a business plan. Whether it all goes up in the air because of COVID, I guess is anyone's answer. And it's been a very interesting year to have launched. That said, yeah, it's a relatively formulaic process of launching 5, 6, maybe 7 major events, as Chris mentioned, that we want to turn into sort of the bucket lists of the endurance space, and it's really looking at if you were starting golf or tennis from scratch now, what would you try to own and what would you try to create? And so we're very, very fortunate in that although triathlon has grown hugely, it's largely a participation sport. There are minimal times when professional triathlon is shown on television, largely because it's just not the business model of the folks that operate in the space. Whereas our model is, both participation. We'll have opportunities for amateur athletes to race alongside the professionals, which is one of the amazing things about triathlon, of course, that has the advantage over in golf and tennis. At Wimbledon, you're not allowed to go and play on center court after the final Sunday, right? Whereas in triathlon, we can do that. And then also, it's ultimately about building out those major events in different locations. And so, short answer to your question, we were intending to launch our first major event in May of this year. It's the Collins Cup, and that's really, I should also touch on it. It's not just about launching events; it's also about looking at the format and how will that work for television. Because just simply putting a sport on TV doesn't make it commercial, right? So it was looking at how do you take the elements of it, whether it's the competition itself and the structure and the rules, the technology that's used to broadcast it, the talent that's used to capture the storytelling and all of those components. We were intending to have that with the Collins Cup in May this year. Obviously, COVID hit. And to touch on the Collins Cup a little bit more, it's based on the Ryder Cup. So we've looked at what's been successful in other sports, what makes the Ryder Cup this incredible event that transcends golf. And there are, probably we could spend an hour talking about that, but from our perspective, it's, the jingoistic element, as Chris mentioned. So we've got athletes representing the USA versus Europe versus international, and then racing in matches as opposed to a gun race. So it's not just the first person across the line; it's athletes from each of those countries in matches, just like the Ryder Cup has. So that was our first event. It was going to be in May. Obviously, the COVID is put tell to that, and so we're planning for it on May the 28th next year.
Yeah, I want to get into some of the theory, Chris, because one of the last times we spoke, or one of the times we've spoken in the past, was at the ATP Next Gen Finals out in Milan, and I wanted to kind of get some of your thoughts on how events are going to develop in a different media age. But let's first of all, guys, it's the elephant in the room, really, when you start a new organization in a year like this. And Chris, I understand you're in Monaco, and Sam, you're in the UK, and I'm sure you have representatives who have kind of who would be convening more often, but instead are generally pinned to whatever home office setups they've got around the world. What's that experience been like, and what have you, I guess, use that time to do? If you've got the capital behind you, so you have that certainty, what have you used that time with the Collins Cup having been postponed to think about?
We actually took what I suppose was perceived at the time as an unusual move, in that we recognized that although it was difficult for us and we were going to delay the Collins Cup, and that was having implications on, production and sponsorships and all those kind of conversations, actually the people in the most difficult situation were the athletes themselves, because by definition professional triathletes are self-employed, right? They're not in teams, they don't have salaries like in cycling or in other sports. And so anyone who was self-employed in a sports environment in COVID was immediately unemployed. And so actually way back in March, we got together with our investors and we brought forward all of the prize money that we were going to pay out this year, and we paid it in March, essentially like our own equivalent of a surplus payment. And some people questioned that and said, was that logical to do, sort of coming out as a new entity without any revenues yet? But to us, it was the most obvious thing to do, because the most important thing to us are the athletes themselves. And so you invest in your greatest assets in good times and in bad times. And this was the worst time that we could have launched. And so that was really our first move. Which certainly has allowed athletes to, continue to train and, not frankly, go back and get jobs, because these are not athletes that are earning, hundreds of millions a year or even, fractions of that number. It's really almost hand to mouth. So that was our first move. And then secondly, more longer term. Yeah, it's been a bit of a challenge. We've struggled to even get this phone call set up with the difficulties of technology and remote working the last few weeks. But Chris and I managed to sneak a little bit of time when the borders opened. I got down to Monaco to go through our longer term plans, and now it's sort of working through when can events come back and operate that would be ready, and begin to have those conversations with broadcasters and producers and sponsors.
And just to pick up on that, the intervention you had with the athletes. I mean, my understanding at the time was it wasn't quite means tested, but there was some reflection of the fact that some of the athletes at the top who could rely on endorsement deals and so on might be better positioned to get through the crisis. So some of that funding was targeted towards athletes who are further down the rankings.
Yes, as not quite means tested. It's more that, so we had $2 million that was paid out to the athletes based on, in fact, all of the money was based on a world ranking. We had $2 million that was paid out for the athletes 1 through 50. And then this was mainly with our investors. They recognized, well, what about athletes 50 to 100? Surely they're in the most precarious position. So we pulled forward an additional $500,000 of investment. So increased it by that amount and paid those out specifically to the lower ranked athletes. And so, yeah, that gave surplus or support or a cushion to sort of enable them to keep training over the whole period of the summer.
Join the conversation with the SportsPro community. Follow us on Twitter @SportsPro. Find us on Instagram @sportspro.media. And connect to SportsPro Media on LinkedIn, where you can also become a part of our specialist OTT community. SportsPro, connecting and inspiring the business world of sport.
Chris, just to take it forward again, as I said, it's interesting in the context of some of those conversations that you'd had at the ATP about how events might look and what different types of media and what younger audiences or different audiences might want out of an event. When you were at the ATP, that next gen series, you kind of trimmed the fat from a 5-set tennis match and had a look and saw what that might look like. And when you look at the triathlon product, I mean, you're coming in more as an outsider, but where do you think the opportunities lie as a media product for it? What kind of things do you think you can try?
Well, it's a very good question. It's slightly too early for me to make categoric statements, which I normally do. But because I sort of, if I get a project, I believe in it, and I believed in the next gen at the ATP, and I was very adamant at the beginning of that whole journey of getting that event off the ground. Was I wasn't ever saying that what we did at Next Gen was or should be the final definitive way tennis should be played and every event should be played like it. What I was using it for was a test case of being able to try all the things that everyone's talked about over the years, almost throw all of it at one event. And it's only when you do a live event with guys on a big stage that you'll see what works and what doesn't. And I was very, very pleased with lots of the stuff that worked. and everyone has an opinion. You'll have all the people that have, that watch tennis for the last 50 years. They don't want any change, and that's fair enough, right? If they like a sport, they tuned into it because they like it for what it is. But you have to look ahead, and the world is changing, media is changing, how people are viewing sports is changing. There's no question about that. No one has the answer, the golden answer, and I think it's trialing things. So with triathlons, to me, this is very much all about how we do the broadcast. So the TV experience is something that I think has huge potential to explore ways of showing endurance sports. Currently when I look at all endurance sports, it looks the same as it's done for the last 20 years. And that's okay for people who already watch it. But if you're looking to grow something, I think you've got to do it better and differently. So I think the reformatting element to make it easier to watch on TV is going to be the exciting challenge ahead. And the Collins Cup actually is an event that really does provide that opportunity, because it's less athletes at the same time. You really do feel the team element. You can get behind the three elements of triathlons easily. And I think, it just gives us the opportunity to start trying things, and some things will work, some things won't. But I think things like performance data, which, everybody loves data. There is a huge amount of data in triathlons. And I think if we can bring that to life, will be a big advantage moving forward.
I guess a couple of other areas, and Sam, you might have an opinion on this as well, but, a couple of other areas where triathlon is in a position to capitalize on trends within the wider media landscape. One is obviously that it's an individual sport, and it's very much kind of athlete centered, and you are an athlete centered organization, and there's a role, I guess, that athletes can play in that, on that content creation side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I go further and say that realistically, this probably as a business model wouldn't have been possible even maybe 10 years ago, because it was so much harder to have a direct to consumer relationship. Whereas now, whether it's social media, whether it's OTT, all of sport is moving D2C. Listening to your conference last week, it's almost the phrase that everyone is using now, when it's not new. I appreciate it's been a couple of years. Having a direct to consumer relationship is such an incredible opportunity for us. And indeed, it's an enabler, whether that's at the athlete level of facilitating and encouraging building out their own profiles, or it's at the organization level and the event level, where we can reach directly to a consumer with an OTT product and not really rely or be as beholden to broadcast partners. Certainly not to say by any sense of the word that broadcast partners aren't an incredibly important part of the ecosystem, but they're no longer the gateway to launching a product like this. And we can ultimately validate the value in triathlon ourselves before building it up over time, which, very comparable to, say, UFC back in the day, 15 years ago.
And the other part of it that I wanted to ask about was, and my attention was drawn to something that Super League Triathlon tried over the summer in Rotterdam, which is where they incorporated a kind of Zwift stage to this. And I don't know whether this is your place or whether this is, perhaps more for organizations that have that more participatory element to them that exists in other parts of the triathlon world. But that opportunity for spectators or fans to take part in the event, in the content, in however you want to frame it, is that something that you would be open to exploring?
Hugely so. As we said earlier, one of the major distinctions between triathlon and almost every other sport is that as an amateur participant, I can toe the line alongside my professional idol. And there are very rare very, very rare. There are a handful, whether it's marathons, whether it's triathlons, where you can do that. I mean, the online sort of element that you mentioned with Super League was incredibly impressive. The innovation that they put together, especially during the pandemic, and so we look at that as great examples of innovation coming into the space, and really it's nice for us because it's another group that is validating the value in this audience. Where it goes longer term, hard to say, but certainly the ability to engage fans that can participate rather than just consume, we think that's a really valuable part of what the sport is, and indeed plays into really where sport is going. Post this whole difficult period the world is going through, the one maybe positive is that more people are running, more people are cycling, more people are swimming, and triathlon should be a huge beneficiary of that trend.
As a brand new entrant, is there ever a line that you're walking between innovation and that ability to, you're not a legacy organization, so you don't have kind of a lot of expectations that you bring with you in terms of how things are presented, but is there ever a line between that and people not taking some of that innovation seriously, for want of a better expression?
Oh, it's a great question, and I think you can't change in reformatting the product. You can't change it so far that people don't recognize what it is. Right. So I think there's a big difference between innovation to drive something forward and just changing things for change's sake. So yeah, I would for sure agree that we've got to be careful there. We're fortunate in our case in that there really has been so little innovation in the broadcast product of the sport, because it's not fundamentally part of the business model. If you look at the incumbent players within endurance sports, it's largely about getting more people to sign up and buy an entry to a race, as opposed to creating profiles of athletes, building them up, ultimately driving to a rights value and increased sponsorship values over time. And so no one's really invested to the level that we think is required. And not to repeat ourselves the last 40 minutes or so, it's pretty simple, right? It's back to the storytelling, building profiles of the athletes, using technology, as Chris said before, whether it's performance data, to ultimately create an exciting, engaging product. And that ultimately comes down to the talent of the people we bring into the organization, like Chris, not to give him too much kudos just at the end of this interview.
Thank you, Sam.
Okay. Well, Chris, now that Sam has buttered you up with some compliments, I wanted to we're taking the opportunity to look forward at what you're doing with the PTO, but I wanted to bring things back at a year or so and just reflect a bit on some of your experiences in your role at the ATP. I mean, just broadly, first of all, how do you feel about that period now? Not necessarily how it ended, but how do you feel about your time there, and what did it teach you about the sports industry?
Well, it was a fantastic. I was there as executive chairman and president for 6 years, which is 2 terms. It was an incredible experience, and yeah, I have absolutely no regrets doing the job. I lived and breathed it 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 6 years. I think what was, the huge positives were that we could actually make some changes, which again, people were very negative when I first started, saying, you'll never, for instance, do next gen. You'll never pull off a team event. You'll never bring in sponsors of the caliber that we did. There were lots of naysayers, and so we achieved a hell of a lot in the 6 years, and it was more political than probably, even though I'd been around the sport a long time, more than I had appreciated, which is fine. But so that part of it was a learning curve for me, in terms of I'd always been used to sort of outlining an idea, presenting an idea, and then taking it forward and the execution of it. So things took longer than first anticipated, because you had to get everyone's buy-in, both sides, from the promoters and from the players. And there was a great experience for me to go through that. So yeah, it was 6 years very well spent, and I learned a lot.
How do you reflect on it now that you've had a year where you've not been at the coalface? Do you ever look back across at tennis and think, do you understand it differently, basically, from the outside? now that you're not involved with it on a day-to-day basis? Obviously, it's a very different year from any that you had in your time in the sport.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside, what I was very keen when I first spoke to Charles and Sam about this role here. So, one of the things with sport is, however big the sport is, you cannot assume that anyone who isn't a voyeur of that sport actually knows anything about it or who anybody is. And so I've always sort of prided myself when I was in tennis and with a really excellent management team that I had around me, was to remind everybody on a constant basis that we talk amongst ourselves in offices about how great, certain things in the sport are, whether it's an athlete winning that that's great for the promotion of the sport, whatever. But to be incredibly realistic, to know that actually in the wide world that isn't engaged in that sport on a day-to-day basis, maybe people don't know as much. And so rarely did I ever employ anyone who was a super fan, because they actually lose judgment of where the sport is in real terms. So when I watch now from sort of outside of the role that I'm in, I think I sort of have the same perspective as when I was doing the job.
Yeah, speaking of which, you say you have no regrets about it or how it ended particularly, but do you ever feel any sense of, I don't want to say ownership, but do you ever feel, you have some investment in it as you're watching how the fortunes of the sport play out?
Yeah, I think especially with the events, the sort of the three major events that I was responsible for, the World Tour Finals at the O2 was sort of my baby. And again, right at the beginning, everyone said that wouldn't work. And it was hugely successful. I'm very proud of that event. The Next Gen again in Milan, obviously on a smaller scale, but, was just as proud of that because it was so different. And then the ATP Cup, which was something that every single person in the sport said we would never, ever achieve. I mean, there wasn't one person who said we would pull this off. And so very proud that event. So, so I feel I will probably always feel, as long as those events go on, a major connection. And there's a sort of part of me in all those events.
And without being a backseat driver or anything like that, is there anything that you feel the ATP as an organisation and the sport more generally, is there anything you feel that they need to keep in mind when it comes to the future health of tennis?
Well, I think it's, constantly I bang the drum about the next generation of fans. People always talked in big sports about, especially when there's a golden era, which tennis clearly has had over the last 10 years, probably the best era in men's professional tennis. Federer, Nadal, Djokovic, Murray, Stan Wawrinka, Del Potro, I mean, the list goes on. I mean, amazing talent. And everyone says, when they go, the game won't be the same. Well, it won't be the same, just as when every era ends, but it's the sport has an amazing ability to produce new champions, and you need rivalries, and they will come. I've never, ever had any doubt about that. And the young talent coming through in tennis is incredible. It's geographically diverse, as I said before. So all the components of success are there. The concern for all sport is where are the next generation of fans. And I think just, tennis is, the ATP are continuing to explore all the avenues to embrace that and to deal with that situation head on, because probably for the next, 5, 6, 7 years, you could probably leave it alone and it would be absolutely fine. But there's going to come a point where, you have to sort of redefine the sport, and whether that's reformatting or, marketing in a different way, whatever that is. I think it's probably all broadcast based, media based, and adapting to the changing times. And yeah, I think there's time to do it, and that's why I wanted to do Next Gen a couple of years ago was never, sport shouldn't rush into making ludicrous changes for change's sake, as Sam mentioned, because that's just daft. You want to try things, you want to test things, and you do it from a position of strength. And then you don't rush into mistakes. And, what you can do is keep the core elements that make that sport, amazing and great and fascinating. You keep those core elements, but adapt it's evolution rather than revolution. And you adapt to the new landscape, the media landscape. And that's going to be the key for all sports, including soccer, by the way.
Finally, in terms of the leadership or visions for the leadership of tennis as a sport as a whole, we've seen the launch of a new players' union that wasn't universally welcomed, perhaps, but also had some support from different areas. We've also seen during lockdown there was a swell of support for greater collaboration, perhaps even moving towards a merger between the ATP and the WTA. From that perspective, as a kind of a North Star for the sport, how does it need to be led? Where does that need to come from? And is it better as a more united sport? Is it better with greater competition, more voices? How do you see that?
It's a difficult one. I mean, Andrea Gaudenzi, who took over from me, I feel very badly for him. He's had a very rough start. I mean, not only with obviously probably the worst pandemic, certainly the world's seen, and having to deal with the logistics of that, then having to deal with the new players' union or association. Don't quite know what it is. Has been incredibly difficult, and I think he deserves some breathing space and a chance to show the next vision and to go along, and to go forward and get people to buy into him. I think that's only fair. In terms of the talk of tennis being fragmented has always been there, and I've never truly understood it, because people would refer, when they use this argument with me, they'd say, well, you look at the NFL, you look at the NBA, but they're incomparable because they're fundamentally domestic sports, right? So if you have a global sport, I mean, you look at, football has the FA, it has the Premier League, it has the Champions League, it has FIFA, UEFA, there is not one universal football organization, I just think the global nature makes it very difficult to have one. And with tennis, you've got the 4 Grand Slams, so you have the Grand Slam nations, and there's 4 of those that sit outside the ATP. Then they're never going to come into the ATP umbrella, and probably shouldn't do. So I think, I don't know, I think it's a lot of insider industry people. It's a very easy jab to say the quote dysfunctionality of it is because of the segmented organizations, but I actually don't believe that's the case. In fact, Andrea Gaudenzi's big, he came in very openly saying, the sport must work together more, and he's, opening his arms to get everybody to work together better, which is a very, very good move. And I think I've always said when times are good, it's almost impossible to make change. Very, very difficult, because when it comes down to the crunch of voting for something, change, whether you're an athlete or a promoter, the decision comes down to, am I going to be better off? Well, actually, things are pretty good at the moment, so, and they'll back off any change because they'll go, actually, I'm okay where we are. When things are bad, especially sort of financially, economically, which the COVID-19 has brought a very bad situation, that's when you are going to get people to really focus on whether they want to change. And so to me, this is the time where change can actually happen. This is a real opportunity in this period, because people are going to be financially hurt. And that's when you'll see people come together much easier than when things are going well.
Okay, well, we'll watch this space. Sam, I'll leave the final comment with you because you've sat out that conversation about a completely different sport.
Not at all. It's really interesting to hear. Well, yeah, parting thought. Oh, I've got an easy one then. Last year, $1.6 billion was spent in golf sponsorship. Triathlon has an almost identical market, but it's growing, that can be reached for a fraction of that cost. So it's a super interesting commercial opportunity for the many listeners of the podcast to get in touch with us about. How about that for a plug?
That's a great plug. I'm not sure how many listeners we have, but invite all of them to think again on triathlon. Guys, thanks very much for your time. It's a really interesting conversation. Thank you to Chris Kermode.
Thank you, Eoin. Thank you very much indeed.
And to Sam Renouf.
Great stuff.
And we'll speak to you again very soon. Bye-bye.
The SportsPro podcast is published by SportsPro Media. The producer is Ed Dixon.